What happens when an avoidant meets a healed empath? It usually does not begin with fireworks. That's the strange part. No chaotic obsession, no instant emotional addiction, no desperate late-night paragraphs trying to force intimacy into existence. It begins quietly, almost suspiciously quiet, like two people accidentally lowering their weapons at the same time without realizing it. The avoidant walks into the connection expecting pressure. Eventually, they expect someone who will slowly demand access to every hidden corner of them. And the healed empath walks in already knowing what emotional distance looks like, already recognizing the subtle hesitation behind charm, the pauses between affection, the invisible wall hiding behind independence. But this time, something feels different because the empath is no longer trying to rescue wounded people into loving them correctly. And the avoidant can feel that difference immediately, even if they cannot explain it. The energy feels lighter, safer. There is emotional depth without emotional grabbing, space without punishment, warmth without suffocation. And for an avoidant, that combination feels almost unreal. It feels like standing near a fire that somehow doesn't burn them. That's why they stay longer than they plan to. That's why their guard lowers without permission. And honestly, if you've ever lived through a connection like this, you already know it doesn't just touch your heart. It exposes every survival pattern you thought was protecting you. So before we go deeper into this, because trust me, it gets painfully real, subscribe to the channel if these kinds of emotionally honest conversations are your thing. Most people talk about relationships on the surface. Here we talk about the parts people hide from themselves. The truth is, avoidants are not emotionally drawn to healed empaths by accident. It happens because healed empaths no longer carry the emotional chaos avoidants are used to managing. In the past, the avoidant may have encountered people who chased harder every time distance appeared, people who panicked at inconsistency, people who tried to earn closeness through emotional overgiving. But a healed empath moves differently. Their love no longer sounds like pleading. Their care no longer feels like control. They ask questions without interrogation. They give affection without making it transactional. And most importantly, they do not collapse every time space appears. That alone changes the emotional atmosphere completely. The avoidant starts relaxing around them in ways they rarely experience. Conversations feel easy. Silence feels safe. There's no immediate pressure to define everything. No emotional scoreboard constantly tracking reassurance. The avoidant mistakes this calm for casualness at first. They assume the empath simply doesn't care that much. But the reality is almost the opposite. The healed empath cares deeply. They just no longer abandon themselves to prove it. And that emotional self-control becomes magnetic because deep down avoidants are exhausted too. People think avoidants enjoy emotional distance, but many of them are trapped inside it. They crave connection while fearing what connection demands from them. So when someone enters their life carrying emotional warmth without emotional dependency, it feels like discovering water after surviving years in a desert pretending they were never thirsty. But the healed empath notices the walls almost immediately, not because they are paranoid, but because they've lived through emotional inconsistency enough times to recognize its language before words are even spoken. They notice how vulnerability appears in small flashes and then disappears. They notice how intimacy increases one day and emotional distance returns the next. They notice the delayed responses, the subtle emotional exits, the discomfort that appears after moments of closeness. Years ago, the empath would have turned these signs into a mission. They would have studied every mixed signal like a puzzle to solve. They would have convinced themselves that enough patience, enough understanding, enough unconditional love could finally make someone stay emotionally present. But healing changes your relationship with emotional unavailability. You stop romanticizing people's potential and start paying attention to their patterns. That does not make the empath cold. It makes them honest. So instead of chasing reassurance, they observe. Instead of forcing deeper intimacy, they allow people to reveal their emotional capacity naturally. And ironically, this emotional restraint pulls the avoidant in even more because now the avoidant feels curiosity instead of pressure. They feel respected instead of emotionally cornered. They begin opening up slowly, almost accidentally. Little truths slip out during late conversations. Old wounds reveal themselves in fragments. The avoidant starts showing parts of themselves they usually protect with silence. And the healed empath listens without trying to immediately fix, heal, or possess them. That's the part that becomes dangerous for the avoidance defenses because they are used to people reacting emotionally to their vulnerability. But this person simply understands it. Then comes the phase that confuses the avoidant the most, the calm beginning. It feels peaceful in a way they cannot fully trust yet. There are no emotional games happening, no guilt trips, no endless need for validation. The empath naturally gives space because they already learned that love cannot survive inside control. So the avoidant feels free while simultaneously feeling connected. And that combination starts lowering defenses they spent years building. They begin texting first more often, staying emotionally present longer, sharing more personal thoughts. Even their body language changes around the empath. The nervous system slowly relaxes. For once, connection doesn't feel like a trap closing around them. It feels like a place where they can breathe. But underneath that comfort, another feeling quietly starts growing. Fear, because emotional safety creates visibility, and visibility terrifies people who survived by hiding emotionally. The avoidant slowly realizes this empath is seeing beyond the curated version of them, beyond the independence performance, beyond the I'm fine mask. The empath notices the sadness behind emotional withdrawal, the loneliness hiding inside self-sufficiency, the fear disguised as needing space. And while part of the avoidant feels relieved to finally be understood without over-explaining, another part feels exposed in a way they cannot control. That is usually the turning point. Because once the avoidant feels truly seen, their nervous system starts sounding internal alarms they don't even consciously understand. The connection suddenly feels too real, too emotionally close, too emotionally important. And avoidants often do not run when they stop caring. They run when they start caring deeply enough for loss to become terrifying. Meanwhile, the healed empath senses the shift immediately. The energy changes. Responses become shorter. Affection becomes inconsistent. Emotional closeness suddenly meets resistance. But unlike their old self, the empath does not spiral into panic trying to force certainty out of someone emotionally overwhelmed. They remain grounded. They continue respecting themselves while respecting the other person's emotional reality. And this is where the entire dynamic changes from every unhealthy version either of them has experienced before. Because the avoidant unconsciously expects pursuit after withdrawal. They expect emotional chasing to restore their sense of control. But the healed empath stays emotionally steady. No begging, no dramatic ultimatums, no loss of dignity in exchange for crumbs of affection. Just quiet awareness. And strangely enough, the calm response begins haunting the avoidant more than any emotional reaction ever could. The avoidant begins pulling away almost automatically after that point. And what makes it tragic is that even they may not fully understand why they are doing it. One moment they were leaning closer, sharing more, allowing emotional intimacy to slowly exist between them. And the next moment, something inside them starts tightening like an internal emergency alarm. Suddenly, they need more space, more distractions, more control. They start convincing themselves the connection is moving too fast. Even if nothing dramatic actually happened, they become harder to reach emotionally. Their replies lose warmth. Their energy becomes inconsistent. And on the surface, it can look cold, almost calculated. But most of the time, it is fear wearing the mask of emotional detachment because avoidants are often deeply uncomfortable with how vulnerable real closeness makes them feel. They spent years surviving through emotional self-containment. Depending on nobody became their form of safety. So when someone enters their life and begins mattering deeply, their nervous system interprets that attachment as potential danger. The healed empath can feel this shift without needing it explained. They notice the emotional retreat happening in real time, the subtle disconnection after intimacy, the emotional static replacing openness. And yet something is completely different now. The empath does not immediately internalize the distance as proof of their unworthiness. They do not not launch into over-explaining, over-performing, or over-loving in an attempt to restore closeness. Healing taught them something painful but powerful. Somebody's inability to stay emotionally present is not always a reflection of your value. Sometimes it is a reflection of their capacity. That realization changes the entire emotional atmosphere because the healed empath does something the avoidant unconsciously never expected. They remain calm, not passive, not emotionless, calm. They acknowledge the distance without collapsing into fear. And to someone with avoidant patterns, this can feel deeply unsettling. They're used to emotional reactions after withdrawal. They are used to people anxiously trying to pull them back into connection. But the empath no longer fights for basic emotional consistency. They stop trying to decode every silence like it contains hidden instructions for earning love correctly. Instead, they stay grounded in themselves. They continue living their life. They continue protecting their peace. And for the avoidant, this creates an unfamiliar emotional experience because now their withdrawal no longer creates the reassurance loop they subconsciously relied on. There is no dramatic pursuit confirming their emotional importance, no desperate attempt to hold on to them at all costs. Just space, honest, quiet space. And that silence starts becoming louder than any argument ever could. The avoidant begins noticing the absence of emotional chasing. They notice the empath is no longer orbiting around their inconsistency. And underneath their relief at having space, another emotion quietly emerges, unease. Because emotional, unavailable people often feel safest when they control the distance. But when the other person peacefully stops reaching toward them, they are suddenly forced to sit alone with the emotional consequences of their own withdrawal. That is when silence becomes the real test between them. Not the dramatic kind filled with screaming endings and blocked numbers. The quieter kind. The kind where two people feel each other's absence in completely different ways. The avoidant initially tells themselves the space is necessary. They focus on work, routines, distractions, anything that restores emotional equilibrium. On the outside, they may appear unaffected, maybe even relieved, but emotional suppression is not emotional absence. The feelings do not disappear simply because they are avoided. They wait underneath the surface, accumulating quietly. Meanwhile, the healed empath experiences the silence differently than they once would have. Years ago, silence would have consumed them. They would have replayed conversations endlessly, searching for hidden mistakes, trying to figure out what they could change to become easier to love. But healing transforms silence from punishment into information. Instead of obsessing, they observe. Instead of abandoning themselves emotionally, they become more emotionally present with themselves. They feel the sadness honestly, but they no longer confuse pain with permission to self-destruct. And this is where something psychologically profound begins happening. The avoidant expects the empath to break the silence emotionally first, to restore the connection by sacrificing their own boundaries. But when that does not happen, the avoidant is forced into a feeling they usually escape from. Loss. Not necessarily the loss of the relationship yet, but the loss of emotional certainty, the loss of access, the loss of someone who understood them without demanding performance. Because healed empaths leave a very specific emotional imprint on avoidance. Their energy feels safe in a way that becomes difficult to replace. They do not manipulate intimacy. They do not weaponize vulnerability. They create emotional warmth without making love feel like emotional labor. And once an avoidant experiences that kind of connection, ordinary surface level interactions begin feeling strangely empty afterward. They start remembering the calm conversations, the emotional patience, the feeling of being emotionally understood without interrogation. The empath becomes associated with nervous system safety, and that memory lingers long after the silence begins. This is the part most people never see. Avoidants are often deeply affected after distance is created, but they process those emotions privately, internally, sometimes painfully slowly. The absence starts echoing in small moments. A song reminds them of the connection. A random memory appears while they're distracted. They compare new conversations to the emotional depth they had before and quietly realize how rare it actually was. But because vulnerability still feels dangerous, they wrestle internally instead of expressing it openly. And while all this is happening inside the avoidant, the healed empath is going through their own transformation too. They begin fully understanding that love cannot survive on potential alone. That emotional chemistry does not automatically create emotional availability. This becomes one of the hardest lessons for deeply empathetic people to accept because empaths naturally see beneath behavior. They see wounds underneath distance, fear underneath detachment, pain underneath emotional inconsistency. But healing teaches them that understanding someone is not the same as being able to build a healthy relationship with them. You can have compassion for someone's trauma and still recognize that their unresolved patterns are hurting you. You can love somebody deeply and still acknowledge they cannot currently meet you where you stand emotionally. And this realization begins strengthening the empath's boundaries in ways the avoidant can feel energetically, even from a distance. The empath stops accepting breadcrumbs disguised as connection. They stop holding on to tiny moments of affection while ignoring prolonged emotional absence. Their standards quietly rise, not from ego, but from self-respect. They no longer measure love by emotional intensity alone. They measure it by consistency, effort, accountability, and emotional presence. And ironically, this is often the exact moment the avoidant begins feeling the true emotional weight of what they are losing. The shift in power is subtle at first, but emotionally it changes everything. The avoidant begins sensing that the healed empath is no longer emotionally waiting for them in the same way. There is still care there, still warmth, still understanding, but the emotional access no longer feels unlimited. The empath has stopped leaving the door wide open for inconsistency to walk in and out whenever it pleases. And for the avoidant, this realization creates a kind of emotional disorientation they rarely admit out loud, because avoidants often believe they are the ones controlling the distance in relationships. They are used to deciding when intimacy increases and when it retreats. But now the dynamic feels different. The empath is no longer emotionally chasing closeness at the expense of themselves. Their energy becomes quieter, more self-contained, more grounded, and suddenly the avoidant feels something they spent years avoiding: uncertainty. They begin questioning whether the connection is truly still available to them, whether the empath is emotionally moving on, whether they waited too long to meet the relationship with consistency. And the irony is painful. The moment the empath finally stops overextending emotionally is often the exact moment the avoidant starts realizing how emotionally significant the connection actually was. Because emotional safety is easy to take for granted until it is no longer constantly offered. Inside the avoidant, an internal war begins unfolding silently. One part of them deeply misses the connection, misses the calm, misses the emotional understanding they rarely experience with other people. But another part still fears what true intimacy demands. They crave closeness while simultaneously fearing dependence. They want connection while resisting vulnerability. So they become trapped between emotional hunger and emotional self-protection. And that conflict creates enormous psychological tension. Some avoidants try distracting themselves from it. Others become emotionally restless without understanding why. They may check the empath's social media more often than they admit, reread old conversations, think about reaching out, and then stop themselves at the last second. Because the deeper issue is not simply fear of rejection. It is fear of exposure. Fear that if they finally let themselves love fully, they will lose control of the emotional distance that once made them feel safe. And for many avoidants, control became survival long before romance ever entered the picture. That is why these connections affect them so deeply. The healed empath unknowingly challenges the entire emotional architecture they built around themselves, not through manipulation, not through force, simply through consistent emotional presence. And that kind of presence becomes impossible to forget once experienced. Meanwhile, the healed empath is learning one of the most heartbreaking truths of emotional maturity. Not everybody who loves you can meet you deeply enough to sustain a healthy connection. This realization hurts differently because the empath can still feel the avoidance care underneath the fear. They can sense the emotional conflict, the affection hidden beneath withdrawal, and that is what makes letting go so difficult. It would almost be easier if the connection had been entirely fake. But healing teaches the empath to stop confusing emotional depth with emotional readiness. Somebody can genuinely care about you and still lack the capacity to show up consistently. Somebody can miss you deeply and still retreat when intimacy becomes real. And this becomes a painful crossroads for the empath because they finally understand that compassion cannot replace compatibility. Emotional insight cannot heal another person's unresolved attachment wounds for them. No amount of patience can force somebody into emotional availability before they are ready to confront themselves honestly. So the empath begins grieving something more complicated than rejection. They grieve potential. They grieve what the connection could have become under different emotional circumstances. They grieve the version of love that almost existed, but never fully stabilized in reality. And still, despite the sadness, they no longer betray themselves trying to save it. That quiet self-respect changes the emotional energy permanently. The avoidant can feel it even without direct conversation. The empath no longer responds from emotional starvation. There is no frantic energy left in them, no silent begging hidden beneath kindness. They still care, but they are no longer abandoning themselves while caring. And that emotional shift often triggers something unexpected inside the avoidant, a desire to reconnect. Sometimes it arrives suddenly. A late night memory hits harder than usual. Sometimes loneliness exposes feelings they successfully suppressed for months. Sometimes they encounter emotionally shallow interactions elsewhere and realize how rare the empath truly was. Whatever the trigger is, the avoidant begins feeling pulled back toward the connection. But now fear mixes with regret because they know something has changed. The empath they left emotionally waiting is no longer standing in the same place. So the reach out often comes cautiously. A simple message, a subtle check-in, something emotionally indirect enough to protect them from vulnerability if the response feels uncertain. But underneath that small gesture is something much heavier, the hope that emotional access still exists. And when the conversation finally happens again, the avoidant expects the old dynamic to return automatically. They expect warmth, emotional availability, maybe even relief from the empath. But instead, they encounter something unfamiliar, emotional clarity. The healed empath responds kindly but differently. There's no desperation in their energy anymore, no immediate emotional overinvestment. They are present without losing themselves, calm without becoming emotionally detached. And for the avoidant, this can feel both comforting and terrifying at the same time, because now they are no longer interacting with someone willing to tolerate emotional ambiguity forever. The empath begins speaking with a level of honesty that changes the emotional atmosphere completely. Not accusations, not emotional explosions, just truth delivered calmly. Truth about inconsistency, truth about emotional absence, truth about what the connection felt like from the inside. And mature honesty is difficult for avoidance to escape from because it removes the emotional smoke screens. There is no chaos to hide behind, no dramatic fight distracting from the real issue, just two people standing face to face emotionally, with one finally refusing to shrink their needs to preserve the connection. In that moment, the avoidant often realizes something profound. The healed empath was never asking for perfection. They were asking for presence. And deep down, the avoidant knows that was the one thing they struggled most to give. And that realization becomes the beginning of the avoidant's real crossroads, because this is the moment where fantasy can no longer protect them. They can no longer hide behind the comforting belief that they simply haven't found the right person yet. The right person stood in front of them and offered emotional safety without control, understanding without judgment, closeness without emotional suffocation. The deeper question now becomes whether they are willing to confront the parts of themselves that made sustained intimacy feel threatening in the first place. And this is where